Hello, everyone, and good evening. It's been a while since I've been on here, and I trust that you are all doing well. I'm working on some new content and hope to bring that to you soon. This evening, I've been feeling compelled to offer some thoughts about the recent vice presidential debate that took place on Tuesday this week. First of all, let me just say that I really appreciated the tone of this debate. In my personal opinion, both Tim Walz and JD Vance did an excellent job. They were both very respectful, willing to agree on certain things, and willing to disagree with a level of civility that we have not seen in politics for quite some time. I was really pleasantly surprised by how respectful and professional these candidates were during the debate, and for that, I applaud both of them. The content of the debate was substantial and policy-driven, another thing that we have not seen in politics recently. I thought both individuals were able to make their viewpoints known in a succinct and direct way. They were not speaking over each other, calling names, or being derogatory to the other opponent in any way. I, for one, felt this debate was really refreshing. To be honest, I thought to myself, perhaps these should be the two who are running for president. Now, I have areas where I agree or disagree with both parties' platforms. But in the spirit of transparency, most of my values as a Christian tend to line up more consistently with the Republican Party's platform. The real turning point for me in this debate, and the real issue I had, was with Tim Walz's misuse of scripture during the debate. Tim Walz, during the debate, used Matthew 25:40, and I'll give you 3 reasons why I have such an issue with the way that he used it. My first issue is this. Tim Walz did not quote the entire verse. And you will find out why this is so important when I bring up the second issue I have with this. We see this very commonly in society at large, and frankly, we even see it in the Christian community as well. The problem is scripture that is being pulled out of context, not quoted correctly or fully, and used to drive home some agenda or point that is being made. This is not the proper way to read or to exegete scripture. Tim Walz brought up Matthew 25:40. Whatever you have done to the least of these, he said. Here is the proper reading of the verse in its entirety. And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Some translations of this verse also will read, my brothers and sisters. That brings me to the second reason that I was concerned with his use of this verse, and that is that he's not using it in the correct context. Right away, we can see that this verse needs more context. It starts with, and the king will answer them. This already tells us that we need to go back to the previous verses to understand what question it is that is being raised, and I encourage you to do that. The issue here is that Tim Walz is using this verse to drive home a point about people who are more fortunate caring for people who are less fortunate, people who are vulnerable in some way. Jesus adds a qualifier here in Matthew 25:40, my brothers, or if you're reading a different translation, my brothers and sisters. In other words, Jesus is actually talking here about the treatment of his followers of Christ. Now, the Greek words in this text could be translated as brothers and as in blood relatives, but that is not the context of this verse. He's not telling all of the saints in heaven, look, the way you took care of my brother James when he was hurting was really important. He's not saying that. He's talking to those who are entering heaven and saying, the way that you treated my brothers, my sisters, followers of Christ, that's what's important. Now, we see often in Scripture that brother is used to refer to another follower of Christ. And indeed, that is how this text would be translated. So now we know that Jesus here in this passage is not talking about just caring for people who are less fortunate. He is talking about the way that we treat fellow believers and care for fellow believers. Let me add this, because frankly, saying that could potentially rub somebody the wrong way. There is plenty of scripture that represents how we as Christians, as followers of Christ, are supposed to love other people. In fact, when Jesus was asked about the two greatest commandments, what were they? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So there is plenty of scripture about how we are supposed to care for others, how we're supposed to love others. An individual who was familiar with scripture would certainly have been able to use some of those other scriptures. But this just shows Tim Walz's lack of knowledge in the Bible. He could have certainly used a verse like Galatians 6:10, for example, which says this, so then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are in the household of faith. His use of Matthew 25:40 was incomplete, and it was out of context. But his point was made. And as I said before, there's certainly plenty of scripture that points to how we are treating others around us. That brings me to my third and final issue with the way that Tim Walz utilized this verse. And perhaps this is the most important. See, Tim Walz has a track record of policymaking that does not align with Scripture at all. He claims to be a Bible-believing Christian, but you must understand that the policies and laws he has enacted in the state of Minnesota are completely out of line with Scripture. I find it ironic that he's arguing for the treatment of the least of these, by which, of course, he's referring to care for the vulnerable and the weak. Is not a baby in the womb the most vulnerable person? Are not babies in the womb the weakest among us? If one is going to make an argument that we should take care of the least of these in that way, why don't we start by taking care of the young children in their mother's womb? Now, I'm a resident of the state of Minnesota, and while Governor Walz has done a few good things in our state, he has also enacted incredibly anti-biblical policies. I fear that this man has either not read the Bible, has not understood the Bible, or perhaps is unwilling to submit to the authority of the truth of Scripture, specifically scriptures or verses that he doesn't like. While I absolutely felt that this debate was the most cordial and respectful political debate I've seen in quite some time, I cannot overlook the fact that Tim Walz incorrectly used Scripture to back up a principle he does not even follow with his own policies. I'm not here today to tell you who to vote for or who not to vote for, but I would offer this one piece of advice. Be very careful about any individual who would throw out of context Scripture at some issue to back up their point. I would also say this, pay attention to the track record of policymaking for each person who runs for office. Their actions and the policies that they support tell us much about where the person truly stands. Thank you for taking the time to listen.